The blood-red sun slipped behind the distant mountains as Kathleen Morgan stared out across the endless Nebraska prairie, her fingers tracing the weathered wood of the porch railing. 3 winters had passed since she'd watched Dawson Reid ride away, promising to return with enough money to start their life together. 3 winters of waiting, hoping, praying that the man she loved would keep his word. Nebraska Territory, 1868. The war had ended 3 years prior, but its aftermath still rippled through the land. New settlers pushed westward while others, like Kathleen, clung to what they had built through hard times and harder losses. The last letter had arrived 8 months ago. Dawson had written of cattle drives in Texas, of money saved, of plans nearly complete. "Wait for me, Kathleen," he'd written in his rough, slanted hand. "When the prairie grass turns green again, I'll be riding home to you." Now spring was unfurling across the land, painting the dull brown landscape with tentative strokes of green. Each morning, Kathleen found herself scanning the horizon, searching for a lone rider making his way toward the small homestead she'd managed to keep running since her father's passing the previous fall. "You're a fool, Kathleen Morgan," she muttered to herself, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "A cowboy's promises are like morning mist gone by midday." Yet still she waited, tending to the few chickens and the milk cow, planting the small garden plot and mending clothes for families in the growing settlement of Willow Creek, to earn what money she could. As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Kathleen sighed and turned to go inside. That's when she heard the distant rhythm of hoofbeats approaching from the south. Her heart quickened as she peered into the gathering darkness. A rider was coming, his silhouette growing more distinct against the darkening horizon with each passing second. The familiar shape of broad shoulders and the distinctive way he sat a horse sent her pulse racing. Kathleen stood frozen, one hand clutching the porch post, the other pressed against her chest. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, dreamed it on countless lonely nights. Now that it might actually be happening, she found herself unable to move, to breathe. The rider drew closer, and there was no mistaking him now. Dawson Reid, his tall frame silhouetted against the twilight sky, his horse moving at a steady walk. He'd grown leaner in his time away, his shoulders perhaps broader, but even at a distance she knew him. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard, removing his hat. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another across the distance, 3 years of separation hanging in the air between them. "Kathleen," he called finally, his voice deeper than she remembered, rough with emotion. She found her voice at last. "You're late, Dawson Reid." A smile broke across his weathered face. "I know. I'm hoping you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." Kathleen wanted to run to him, to throw herself into his arms, but pride kept her rooted to the porch. "That depends on what you've brought me that's worth 3 winters of waiting." Dawson dismounted in one fluid motion, patting his horse's neck before reaching into his saddlebag. He crossed the yard with long, deliberate strides, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. In the fading light, she could see the changes in him, the deeper lines around his eyes, the scar that hadn't been there before cutting across his left cheek, the flecks of gray at his temples. "I promised I'd come back when I had something to offer you," he said, his voice low. "Something more than just dreams and empty pockets." He extended his hand, uncurling his fingers to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the last light of day. "I'm hoping this might be worth the wait." Tears welled in Kathleen's eyes as she descended the steps slowly. "You fool," she whispered, her voice catching. "Did you really think I needed a ring to wait for you?" Dawson's eyes, gray as storm clouds, searched her face. "I needed to give you one." To prove I could be the man you deserve." She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the ring. "Tell me something first," she said. "Where have you been all this time? What took you so long?" Dawson took a deep breath. "Texas, mostly. Drove cattle north to Kansas. Worked mines in Colorado for a spell. Got into some trouble, got out of it. Made money, lost some, made more." He paused, swallowing hard. "Every day, every single day, Kathleen, I thought of you, of coming back." "The letters stopped," she said quietly. Pain flashed across his face. "I got bushwhacked outside of Dodge City last fall. Took a bullet in my shoulder, lost my horse, my money, nearly lost my life. Took me months to recover, to earn enough to finish my journey home." His voice roughened. "I was afraid you'd given up on me." Kathleen shook her head slowly, a tear trailing down her cheek. "I made a promise too, Dawson Reid." His hand trembled slightly as he held the ring between them. "Then I'm asking you to make another one. Marry me, Kathleen." "I know I don't deserve it after making you wait so long." But she didn't let him finish. Her fingers closed over the ring, and then she was in his arms, her face pressed against the solid warmth of his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and horses and the open range that clung to him. "Yes," she whispered against his shirt. "The answer has always been yes." Dawson's arms tightened around her, and when he tilted her face up to his, the kiss they shared was both a homecoming and a new beginning. Later, seated at her small kitchen table, Dawson watched as Kathleen moved about preparing a simple meal. The lamplight cast a warm glow over her features, highlighting the auburn in her hair. She'd grown more beautiful in his absence, he thought, stronger, more assured in her movements. "Your father?" he asked quietly, noticing the absence of the man who'd reluctantly given his blessing to their courtship before Dawson had ridden out. Sadness flickered across Kathleen's face. "Pneumonia took him last November. It came on sudden and fierce." She set a plate before him. "I buried him on the hill next to Mama." Dawson reached for her hand. "I'm sorry I wasn't here." She squeezed his fingers. "You're here now." After a moment she asked, "What are your plans, Dawson, now that you've returned?" He reached into his vest pocket, producing a folded document. "I bought land," he said, spreading the deed on the table. 500 acres just west of here, good grazing land with a creek running through it." His eyes met hers. "I've got a small herd of cattle being driven up from Texas by some fellows I worked with. They'll arrive in about a month." Kathleen's eyes widened. "You're starting a ranch," Dawson nodded. "With the railroad pushing further west each year, there's good money in beef. I've learned a lot these past years." He hesitated. "It won't be easy at first. We'll need to build a proper house, barns. It'll be hard work." A smile tugged at Kathleen's lips. When has anything worth having come easy? Relief and love washed over Dawson's face. "There's a preacher riding circuit. He'll be in Willow Creek next Sunday. Unless you want to wait longer, plan a proper wedding." Kathleen laughed, the sound filling the small cabin. "Dawson Reid, I've waited quite long enough. Sunday will do just fine." As they talked into the night, sharing stories of their time apart, plans for their future together, Kathleen felt the weight of 3 lonely winters lifting from her shoulders. Outside, the Nebraska wind whispered through the newly green prairie grass, carrying the promise of spring and new beginnings. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Kathleen woke to the unfamiliar but welcome sound of movement outside Dawson, already up and tending to his horse and her small collection of livestock. She dressed quickly and joined him in the yard, pausing to watch as he repaired a loose board on the chicken coop with practiced ease. "You didn't have to start working so soon," she called. Dawson looked up, hammer in hand, and the smile that spread across his face made her heart flip in her chest. "Got 3 years of chores to make up for," he replied, driving in a final nail before straightening. Besides, I've been sleeping under the stars for so long, I woke with the dawn out of habit. Kathleen approached, handing him a cup of coffee. "Tell me more about this land you bought. When can I see it?" "Today, if you'd like," he said, taking a grateful sip. "It's about an hour's ride west, near the fork in the creek. There's a small cabin already there, nothing fancy, but it'll give us shelter while we build something better." After a quick breakfast, they saddled up Kathleen on her father's old mare, Dawson on his trail-worn gelding, and rode west across the rolling prairie. Spring had arrived in earnest, with wildflowers dotting the grassland and new leaves budding on the scattered cottonwoods that lined the creek beds. As they rode, Dawson pointed out landmarks, sharing his vision for the ranch he planned to build. "We'll put the main house there on that rise," he said, gesturing toward a gentle slope overlooking a bend in the creek. "Good view in all directions, and the water's close by." Kathleen studied the land with a critical eye, seeing not just what was there but what could be. "The soil looks good for a garden on that southern slope," she observed, "and there's plenty of grass for grazing." Pride filled Dawson's chest as he watched her. Most women would be focusing on the house, on comforts, but Kathleen's practical assessment reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She understood what it meant to build something from nothing. They reached the small cabin by midday. It was indeed basic, one room with a stone fireplace, a dirt floor, and a crude bunk built against one wall. But the roof was sound, and the walls were thick logs, well chinked against the weather. "It's not much," Dawson said, suddenly anxious as he watched Kathleen inspect the humble dwelling. To his surprise, she laughed, the sound bright in the quiet of the prairie. "It's twice the size of the dugout Papa and I lived in our first year here," she said, running her hand along the rough-hewn table that was the cabin's only furniture. "And it's ours, Dawson. That makes it a palace in my eyes." Relief flooded through him, and he moved to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I promise you'll have a proper house before winter comes again," he murmured against her hair. Kathleen turned in his arms, her green eyes serious as they met his. "I don't need fancy things, Dawson. I just need you to stay this time." He nodded, understanding the fear that still lingered beneath her words. "Wild horses couldn't drag me away again," he vowed, sealing his promise with a kiss that left them both breathless. They spent the afternoon exploring the property, Dawson showing her the spring-fed pond where fat trout darted in the clear water, the natural meadow where he planned to plant hay for winter feed, the sheltered draw where they could build a barn and corrals. As the sun began its westward descent, they sat beneath a large cottonwood tree, sharing the lunch Kathleen had packed that morning. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the rustling of new leaves overhead and the distant call of meadowlarks. "I kept every letter you sent," Kathleen said finally, plucking a blade of grass and twirling it between her fingers. "Read them so many times the paper started wearing thin." Dawson watched her profile, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the slight upturn of her nose. "I wish I could have written more. There were times when finding paper and a post station seemed impossible." She nodded. "I understood that. It was the not knowing that was hardest, when weeks turned to months without word." She trailed off, then turned to face him directly. "Dawson, I need to know, was there ever anyone else?" The question took him by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. 3 years was a long time, and they both knew the world was full of temptations for a man on his own. "No," he answered honestly, holding her gaze. "There were opportunities, I won't lie about that, but none of them were you, Kathleen, and you're the only one I've ever wanted." The tension in her shoulders eased, and she leaned against him. "There was a settler who came through last summer," she admitted quietly. Daniel Forrester. He asked my father for permission to court me. Dawson's arm tightened around her, a flare of jealousy shooting through him despite himself. What happened? I told him my heart already belonged to a cowboy who'd promised to return, she said simply. Papa thought I was being foolish, holding on to a dream that might never come true, but I knew you'd come back. Somehow I just knew. Humbled by her faith in him, Dawson pressed a kiss to her temple. I don't deserve you, Kathleen Morgan, she smiled up at him. Probably not. But you're stuck with me anyway. As afternoon faded toward evening, they reluctantly mounted up for the ride back to Kathleen's homestead. They rode side by side, occasionally pointing out a hawk circling overhead or a rabbit darting through the grass, but mostly content in shared silence. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Word spread quickly through the small community of Willow Creek that Dawson Reid had returned, and that a wedding was planned for Sunday. Neighbors Kathleen had helped through difficult times now arrived bearing gifts, jars of preserves, a hand-sewn quilt, offers of labor to help establish the new ranch. On Saturday, Kathleen stood in her small bedroom, carefully unpacking her mother's wedding dress from the cedar chest where it had been stored for nearly 20 years. The ivory silk was yellowed with age but still beautiful, with delicate lace trim at the collar and cuffs. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Kathleen," Dawson called, "Mrs. Peterson is here to see you." Eleanor Peterson was the closest thing Willow Creek had to a society lady, having come from Boston to join her husband who'd established the town's general store. She had taken Kathleen under her wing after her mother's death, teaching her the finer points of needlework and proper etiquette. "Eleanor," Kathleen greeted her, ushering the older woman into the bedroom. "I was just looking at Mama's dress." Eleanor clucked her tongue, examining the garment with a critical eye. "It needs a good pressing, dear, but it will be lovely on you." She reached into the basket she carried. "I've brought you something borrowed for tomorrow." From the basket, she produced a delicate lace veil, yellowed with age but still exquisite. "I wore this when I married Mr. Peterson 30 years ago," she explained. "Every bride should have something special on her wedding day." Tears pricked at Kathleen's eyes as she accepted the gift. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll take the greatest care with it." Eleanor patted her cheek affectionately. "That young man of yours has grown into quite the handsome fellow," she remarked, "though he looks like he's seen some hard times." Kathleen nodded, her fingers tracing the lace pattern of the veil. "He has. We both have. But that's behind us now." The older woman's expression grew serious. "Life out here is never easy, Kathleen. You know that better than most. There will be good years and bad, times of plenty and times of want." "I know," Kathleen replied simply. "But I've watched you these past 3 years," Eleanor continued. "Waiting, working, never giving up hope. If anyone can build a life worth having in this harsh country, it's you and that determined cowboy of yours." After Eleanor left, Kathleen found Dawson in the barn, mending a broken harness with practiced efficiency. She paused in the doorway, taking a moment to simply watch him work, still hardly believing he was really here, that tomorrow they would be husband and wife. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, his serious expression melting into a smile that never failed to make her heart race. "Everything all right?" she nodded, moving to sit beside him on the hay bale. "Just thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that." Dawson set aside his work, taking her hand in his. His palm was calloused, his fingers strong and capable, having second thoughts. He asked, only half joking. Kathleen shook her head firmly. "Not a single one. You." "Only that I should have come back sooner," he admitted. I kept thinking I needed more money, more security to offer you. I wanted everything to be perfect. She squeezed his hand. Perfect isn't real, Dawson. Life isn't perfect, but it can be wonderful anyway. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. How did you get so wise, Kathleen Morgan? 3 winters alone gives a woman plenty of time to think, she replied with a small smile. Now, tell me more about these cattle you have coming. How many head? What breed? As Dawson detailed his plans for building their herd, starting with the 50 head of longhorns currently being driven north from Texas, Kathleen found herself marveling at how much he'd learned in his time away. The boy who'd left with dreams and determination had returned a man with knowledge and experience. Sunday dawned clear and warm, a perfect spring day. Kathleen stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her. Eleanor had arrived at dawn to help her dress and arrange her hair, which now fell in soft curls beneath the borrowed veil. Her mother's dress fit as if it had been made for her, skimming her slender frame and highlighting the auburn tones in her hair. Around her neck hung her mother's cameo pendant, and on her feet were the new leather shoes Dawson had surprised her with the previous evening, a wedding gift he'd purchased in Omaha on his journey home. "You look beautiful," came a deep voice from the doorway. Kathleen turned to find Henry Williams, their nearest neighbor and her father's oldest friend, standing there with tears in his eyes. "Your parents would be so proud," he said gruffly. "Your father asked me before he passed to stand in his place if this day ever came." Swallowing the lump in her throat, Kathleen nodded. "I'd be honored, Mr. Williams." The small church in Willow Creek was filled to capacity. Though the settlement was still little more than a cluster of buildings around a crossroads, it seemed everyone for miles had turned out to witness the wedding of Kathleen Morgan to the cowboy, who'd returned to claim her after 3 long years. Dawson stood at the front of the church, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit, his dark hair slicked back, his face freshly shaved. When Kathleen appeared at the back of the church on Henry Williams' arm, a collective murmur of appreciation swept through the congregation. But Kathleen saw only Dawson, his gray eyes locking with hers across the small sanctuary, filled with such love and promise that it stole her breath away. The walk down the aisle seemed both endless and over in an instant. "Who gives this woman to be married?" asked Reverend Thompson. "I do, on behalf of her late father," Henry answered, placing Kathleen's hand in Dawson's before stepping back. The ceremony was simple and brief, the traditional vows exchanged with clear voices despite the emotion that thickened them. When Dawson slipped the gold band onto Kathleen's finger, his hand trembled slightly. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Dawson's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, and the cheers that erupted from their friends and neighbors nearly raised the roof of the little church. The celebration that followed at the town's small hotel was jubilant, with music provided by a local fiddler and enough food to feed twice their number, brought by neighbors who understood that in a land as harsh as the Nebraska Territory, community was as essential as rain. As the sun began to set, Dawson found Kathleen sitting at a table, watching the dancing with a contented smile. "Mrs. Reid," he said, offering his hand. "May I have this dance?" Her smile broadened as she took his hand and allowed him to lead her onto the floor. "I like the sound of that," she murmured as he pulled her close. "Mrs. Reid." They swayed together to the slow tune, oblivious to the knowing smiles of those around them. "I have another surprise for you," Dawson whispered against her ear. "I arranged for the Petersons to watch over your homestead for a few days." Kathleen drew back slightly to look at him. "Oh, and why would we need that? A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Because I'm taking my bride to Omaha for a proper honeymoon. 3 nights at the finest hotel in the city." Her eyes widened. "Dawson, we can't afford such extravagance." "We can," he assured her. "Just this once. We'll leave tomorrow morning on the eastbound stage and be back by Friday to start our life together properly." Before she could protest further, he silenced her with a kiss that left no doubt about his intentions for their honeymoon, proper or otherwise. Later that night, after the last of the well-wishers had departed and they had returned to Kathleen's now their small homestead, Dawson carried his bride across the threshold as tradition demanded. Inside, someone leaner, Kathleen suspected had been busy in their absence. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the table, the bed was made with crisp linens, and a bottle of wine with 2 glasses waited beside it. "It appears we have thoughtful friends," Dawson observed, setting Kathleen gently on her feet. She nodded, suddenly shy despite the years they'd known each other, the months of courtship before his departure, the passionate kisses they'd shared since his return. This was different, the beginning of their life together as husband and wife. Sensing her nervousness, Dawson poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to her. "To new beginnings," he said softly, touching his glass to hers. The wine was sweet and eased the tension that had crept between them. As they sipped, Dawson reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "One more gift," he said, extending it to her. "I've been carrying this a very long time." Curious, Kathleen unwrapped the package to reveal a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she gasped. Inside were dozens of pressed wildflowers, delicate blooms from across the territories he'd traveled, each labeled with a location and date. "I started collecting them the day after I left," Dawson explained, watching her face. "One for each place I went. I hoped someday I could show you all the beautiful things I'd seen while we were apart." Tears filled Kathleen's eyes as she carefully turned the pages, seeing the physical evidence of his journey: columbines from Colorado, bluebonnets from Texas, sunflowers from Kansas, and dozens more. "The last one I added just yesterday," he said. She turned to the final page to find a sprig of prairie grass from their new land, labeled simply "Home." Looking up from the book, Kathleen found Dawson watching her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. "I love you, Dawson Reid," she whispered. "I have from the moment you pulled me from that creek when my skirts got tangled and I nearly drowned." He laughed softly at the memory. "You were 16 and stubborn as a mule, insisting you didn't need rescuing even as you were being swept downstream. And you were 18 and so serious, lecturing me about the dangers of spring runoff while wringing water from your hat." She set aside the book and stepped closer to him. "I think I knew even then that you were the one I'd wait for, no matter how long it took." Dawson's hands came to rest on her waist, drawing her against him. "No more waiting," he promised, lowering his head to capture her lips with his. Their first night as husband and wife was everything Kathleen had dreamed during the long, lonely winters of their separation: tender, passionate, a perfect joining of 2 people who had overcome distance and time to find their way back to each other. As moonlight spilled through the window, casting silver patterns across the bed, Kathleen rested her head on Dawson's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Tell me more about our ranch," she murmured sleepily. "Tell me everything you imagine it will be." And so he did, painting pictures with words of the home they would build, the cattle that would dot the hillsides, the children they might have someday running through fields of wildflowers. Kathleen drifted to sleep in his arms, secure in the knowledge that some promises, against all odds, were indeed kept. The stagecoach journey to Omaha the next day was dusty and cramped, but Kathleen hardly noticed the discomfort. She was too busy drinking in the changing landscape as they traveled east, marveling at the increasing signs of civilization, more frequent homesteads, actual roads rather than trails, and finally, the sprawling outskirts of Omaha itself. The city had grown considerably since she'd last seen it as a child. Streets bustled with activity, storefront windows displayed goods from back east, and the hotel Dawson had chosen for their stay was grander than any building Kathleen had ever entered. "This is too much," she whispered as a uniformed bellboy carried their single trunk up a sweeping staircase. Dawson squeezed her hand. "Nothing's too much for you." Their room overlooked the Missouri River, with a huge bed covered in a quilted counterpane and actual running water in a porcelain basin. Kathleen moved from window to bed to washstand, touching everything in wonder. "How can you afford all this?" she asked as the bellboy departed with Dawson's generous tip. A shadow passed over Dawson's face. "I told you I got into some trouble in Dodge City," he said slowly. "What I didn't tell you was why I was carrying so much cash." Kathleen sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. "I just sold a herd of cattle I'd helped drive up from Texas," he explained, pacing to the window and back. "Good money. My cut was nearly $1,500. I was planning to head home then, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" Kathleen prompted gently. Dawson ran a hand through his hair. "I got talked into a poker game. High stakes. I should have walked away, but I was winning, Kathleen, winning big. I thought just a little more and I could buy twice the land, a better start for us." Understanding dawned. "That's when you got bushwhacked," he nodded grimly. "Lost everything." "Would have lost my life too if a saloon girl hadn't heard them planning the ambush and warned me. I still took a bullet, but I was ready for them. Managed to get away, but they got my money." Kathleen rose and went to him, placing her hands on his chest. "That's in the past now." "I promised myself then that I'd never gamble again," Dawson continued. "Took work where I could find it ranch hand, cattle drive, even mining for a few months. Saved every penny." His eyes met hers, filled with determination. "I won't risk our future that way again, Kathleen. I swear it." She reached up to touch his face, fingers tracing the scar on his cheek that she now realized must have come from that night. "I believe you," she said simply. "Now, are you going to show your wife the city, or are we going to spend our entire honeymoon in this room?" A slow smile spread across his face. "Both," he promised, pulling her into his arms. "Definitely both." The 3 days in Omaha passed in a whirlwind of experiences. Dawson took Kathleen to fine restaurants where they ate food she'd only read about in magazines. They attended a theatrical performance that left her spellbound, and spent hours exploring shops where Dawson insisted on purchasing small luxuries, a bottle of French perfume, a pair of kid leather gloves, ribbons for her hair. On their final night, they walked along the riverfront, watching as the setting sun painted the Missouri in shades of gold and crimson. "We should get back," Kathleen said reluctantly. "The stage leaves early tomorrow." Dawson nodded but made no move to turn back toward the hotel. Instead, he led her to a bench overlooking the water. "I've been thinking," he said as they sat, "about the future, our future." Kathleen looked at him questioningly. "The cattle drive should reach our land in about 3 weeks," he continued. "We'll need to build corrals before then, get ready for winter." He took her hand. "It's going to be hard work, Kathleen, harder than anything you've done before." She squeezed his fingers. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "I know," he said, his expression serious. "But there's something else we need to discuss, something important." Concern flickered across her face. "What is it?" Dawson took a deep breath. "Your homestead. We need to decide what to do with it." Understanding dawned. "You want to sell it," she said, not a question. He nodded slowly. The money would help us establish the ranch faster. Better buildings, more cattle, maybe even hired help for the first year. Kathleen was silent for a long moment, staring out at the river. The homestead was the last physical connection to her parents, to the life they'd built together. The thought of strangers living in the cabin her father had built with his own hands, tending the garden where her mother had taught her to grow food for their table. "We don't have to decide right away," Dawson said gently, reading her expression. "We can keep both places, at least for now." She turned to him, her green eyes serious in the fading light. "No, you're right. Sentimentality won't build our future." She squared her shoulders. "We'll sell the homestead and put everything into making our ranch successful." Dawson studied her face. "Are you certain?" "I don't want you to regret this." "I won't," she said firmly. "My parents would understand. They came west to build something new just as we're doing." A small smile touched her lips. "Besides, I'm taking the most important part with me, their memory and the lessons they taught me." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Kathleen Reid." "And I love you," she whispered. "Now take me back to our room and show me how much." The return journey to Willow Creek seemed to pass in half the time, perhaps because they were both eager to begin their new life together. They collected Kathleen's few treasured possessions from the homestead, along with the livestock and tools they would need, and made the hour-long journey west to their land, their future. The cabin seemed smaller than Kathleen remembered, especially when filled with their combined belongings, but she set about making it a home with characteristic determination. Curtains were hung at the single window, the dirt floor swept and covered with a braided rug she'd made during one of the long winters of waiting, and wildflowers arranged in a jar on the rough table. Dawson, meanwhile, began the backbreaking work of building corrals and a small barn in preparation for the cattle's arrival. From dawn until dusk, the sound of his axe rang out across the prairie as he felled trees along the creek and transformed them into the structures that would anchor their new ranch. Neighbors came to help Henry Williams and his sons, the Peterson boys from town. Even the blacksmith from Willow Creek arrived with his tools to fashion hinges and latches. In the frontier tradition, they worked together to establish the newcomers, understanding that someday they might need the same help in return. By the end of May, the basic structures were in place: a sturdy barn, corrals capable of holding the expected herd, and the foundation laid for what would eventually be their permanent home. The days were long and exhausting, but Kathleen and Dawson fell into bed each night with the satisfying weariness that comes from working toward a shared dream. On the first day of June, Kathleen was tending her newly planted garden when she heard Dawson call out. Looking up, she shaded her eyes against the bright sunlight to see him pointing south. On the horizon, a cloud of dust was rising, the unmistakable sign of cattle on the move. She hurried to join him on the small rise where he stood, his face split by a wide grin. "They're here," he said, excitement evident in his voice. "Our future, Kathleen." Together they watched as the herd came into view, driven by 4 cowboys on horseback. The cattle moved at a steady pace, their long horns silhouetted against the blue sky, hooves raising dust that turned golden in the afternoon sun. The lead rider broke away from the herd and galloped toward them. As he drew closer, Dawson stepped forward with a shout of recognition. "Tom." "You old scoundrel," the rider, a weathered man with a salt and pepper beard, dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. "Dawson Reid," he drawled, extending a hand. "Wasn't sure we'd find you. Territory all looks the same after a while." Dawson pumped his hand, then turned to Kathleen. "Kathleen, this is Tom Blackwood, Best trail boss in Texas, though don't tell him I said so or his hat won't fit anymore." He slipped an arm around her waist. "Tom, meet my wife, Kathleen." Tom removed his hat, revealing a shock of gray hair plastered to his head with sweat. "Madam," he said with a respectful nod. "Dawson here talked about you so much on the trail I feel like I know you already. Glad to see he wasn't just spinning yarns about the prettiest girl in Nebraska." Kathleen felt her cheeks warm. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. You and your men must be exhausted. I have stew on the fire and coffee ready." Tom's weathered face creased in a grateful smile. "Now I see why Dawson was in such an all-fired hurry to get back to you. A pretty face and a hot meal can't ask for more than that after weeks on the trail." As Tom signaled to his companions to bring the herd into the waiting corrals, Dawson squeezed Kathleen's hand. "Our first cattle," he said softly. "Our ranch is officially beginning." That evening, after the cattle were settled and the drovers fed, they sat around a campfire outside the cabin. Tom and his men shared stories of the drive north, the rivers they'd crossed, the storms they'd weathered, the minor mishaps and major triumphs along the way. "Your husband's got a good eye for cattle," Tom told Kathleen as she refilled his coffee cup. "These are prime stock, mostly young cows that'll give you calves for years to come, with a few good bulls mixed in." Dawson nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "And at the price we agreed on, we've got enough left to add another 20 head before winter." Tom leaned back, stretching his booted feet toward the fire. "Market for beef is only going to grow with the railroads pushing west. You've picked a good time to start ranching and good land to do it on." After the trail hands retired to their bedrolls in the barn, Kathleen and Dawson lingered by the dying fire. Above them, stars blanketed the vast Nebraska sky, so bright and numerous they seemed close enough to touch. "Happy?" Dawson asked, his arm around her shoulders. Kathleen nodded, resting her head against him. "It feels real now. All those years of dreaming, waiting, and now we're really doing it." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I keep thinking about our children someday running across this land, learning to ride, helping with the cattle." The thought sent a pleasant warmth through Kathleen. "Children need a proper house," she reminded him with a smile. "We'll start building as soon as the cattle are settled," Dawson promised. "By harvest time, you'll have your house, Mrs. Reid." As summer unfolded across the prairie, the Reid Ranch began to take shape. The cattle adapted to their new range, growing fat on the abundant grass. Dawson, with help from neighbors and the occasional hired hand, continued working on the main house, a sturdy two-story structure of locally cut timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Kathleen divided her time between tending her expanding garden, keeping their small household running smoothly, and helping with ranch work when needed. She learned to ride astride like the men when checking fences or moving cattle, scandalizing some of the more proper ladies from town, but earning the respect of the local ranchers. In late July, Tom Blackwood returned, this time with a wagon loaded with supplies from Omaha and 20 additional head of cattle purchased with the proceeds from the sale of Kathleen's homestead. "Place is coming along nicely," he commented as Dawson showed him the progress on the house. "You've accomplished a lot in a short time." Dawson nodded, pride evident in his stance. "Couldn't have done it without Kathleen. She works as hard as any man and never complains." Tom's gaze shifted to where Kathleen was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 trees. "You got lucky there, my friend. Women like that are rare as gold nuggets in a mountain stream." "Don't I know it?" Dawson agreed. "Now let's talk about those cattle you brought." As the men moved toward the corrals, Kathleen watched them go, a smile playing at her lips. She'd overheard their conversation and found herself warmed by Dawson's praise. The work was indeed hard. Her hands were calloused, her skin tanned by the sun, her dresses often stained with dirt or grease, but she wouldn't trade this life for all the comfort and luxury of the East. By mid-August, the house was complete enough to move in, though some interior finishing work remained. Kathleen stood in the center of what would be their parlor, marveling at the space after months in the one-room cabin. 4 rooms downstairs and 3 up, she murmured, turning slowly to take it all in. It's like a palace. Dawson leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a smile. Wait until you see what Tom brought from Omaha, he said, beckoning her to follow him outside. Behind the wagon, covered with a tarp, was a shape Kathleen couldn't quite identify. Dawson pulled back the covering with a flourish to reveal a beautiful oak rocking chair, its wood gleaming with polish, its seat and back cushioned with red velvet. Dawson. Kathleen gasped, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It's beautiful, but how could we afford such a luxury? I've been setting aside a little from each cattle sale, he explained. Every home needs at least one fine piece of furniture, and I thought someday you might rock our babies to sleep in it. Tears sprang to Kathleen's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. It's perfect, she whispered, sitting in the chair and running her hands over the armrests. Absolutely perfect. Tom, who had been watching from a discreet distance, cleared his throat. There's something else in the wagon you might want to see, madam. Curious, Kathleen followed him to the front of the wagon, where he pulled out a large flat package wrapped in brown paper. Dawson mentioned you had a fondness for reading, but lost most of your books in a roof leak last winter. Thought these might help start a new collection. Inside the package were a dozen books, novels, poetry collections, even a medical reference guide for frontier families. Kathleen clutched them to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Both of you. This means more than I can say. That evening, after Tom had departed with promises to return in the spring, Kathleen and Dawson sat on their new porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The rocking chair had been given a place of honor in their bedroom, but would eventually move to the nursery they both hoped would someday be filled with children's laughter. I've been thinking, Dawson said, breaking the comfortable silence. We should give our ranch a proper name. Kathleen considered this. What did you have in mind? He shrugged. Most folks around here name their places after themselves or some natural feature. Reid Ranch has a nice ring to it. It does, she agreed, but I was thinking of something that means more to us personally. Dawson turned to look at her, curiosity in his eyes. Such as? A smile played at the corners of her mouth. What about Springtime Ranch, since you returned to me in the spring with that ring you'd promised? Dawson's face softened at the memory. Springtime Ranch, he repeated, testing the words. I like it. A reminder of new beginnings. And promises kept, Kathleen added softly. He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips. Promises kept, he agreed. Always. As summer gave way to fall, the newly christened Springtime Ranch continued to flourish. The cattle grew fat on the abundant grass. The garden yielded a bountiful harvest that Kathleen preserved for the coming winter, and the house became more of a home with each passing day. In late September, with the first hints of autumn coloring the prairie, they hosted a house-warming gathering for the neighbors who had helped them establish their ranch. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by Kathleen and the other women. Children played tag between the barn and corrals while the men discussed cattle prices and weather predictions for the coming winter. Alina Peterson cornered Kathleen in the kitchen as she was slicing a fresh baked apple pie. This house is a credit to you and Dawson, she said, surveying the tidy room with its shelves of preserves and herbs hanging from the rafters to dry. "You've accomplished more in a few months than many do in years." Kathleen smiled her thanks, though privately she thought of all that still remained to be done: curtains to be sewn for the upstairs windows, furniture to be built for the spare bedrooms, the root cellar that needed to be expanded before the first frost. "And how are you feeling, my dear?" Eleanor asked with a knowing look. "Any changes you've noticed recently?" Kathleen nearly dropped the pie server. "What do you mean?" The older woman patted her arm. "I've raised 5 children of my own, Kathleen. I recognize the glow of a woman who might be expecting." Heat rushed to Kathleen's cheeks. She had been feeling unusually tired lately, and certain foods that she normally enjoyed now turned her stomach. But she'd attributed it to the long hours of work and the change of seasons. I'm not sure," she admitted in a whisper. "It's possible, I suppose." Eleanor nodded sagely. "You mark my words. By this time next year, you'll be bouncing a baby on your knee in that fine rocking chair Dawson bought you." The thought sent a flutter of excitement through Kathleen's chest. A baby, their baby. The beginning of the family they'd dreamed of building. "Don't say anything to Dawson," she pleaded. "Not until I'm certain." "Of course not," Eleanor assured her. "But perhaps pay a visit to Dr. Matthews when you're next in town. He can confirm what I suspect is already true." As the guests departed with the setting sun, Kathleen found herself watching Dawson with new eyes as he bid farewell to the last of their neighbors. Could she really be carrying his child already? The possibility filled her with equal parts terror and joy. That night, as they prepared for bed, Dawson noticed her unusual quietness. "Everything all right?" he asked, pulling his shirt over his head. "You seem distracted." Kathleen smiled, setting down the hairbrush she'd been running through her long auburn locks. "Just tired," she said. "It was a wonderful day, but hosting so many people is exhausting." He came to stand behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders and massaging gently. "You amazed everyone with your cooking and hospitality. I lost count of how many compliments I received on my choice of wife." She leaned back against him, savoring the strength and warmth of his body. "And were you complimented as well? For your choice of husband," Dawson chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Henry Williams did mention you could have done worse. Coming from him, that's high praise indeed." Turning in his arms, Kathleen reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar on his cheek that had become so familiar to her fingers. "I couldn't have done better," she said softly. "Not if I'd searched the whole world over." The look that came into his eyes, then tender, passionate, filled with love, made her heart race. As he lowered his head to kiss her, Kathleen allowed herself to imagine their family growing, a child with Dawson's gray eyes and her auburn hair running across the prairie grasses of Springtime Ranch. October brought the first frost, painting the landscape with delicate white crystals that melted into dew as the sun rose. Kathleen stood at the kitchen window, watching as Dawson and 2 hired hands moved a group of cattle to a sheltered pasture closer to the barn. Soon they would need to begin supplementing the animals' grazing with hay cut and stored during the summer months. Her hand drifted to her stomach, still flat, but harboring a secret she could no longer deny. A visit to Dr. Matthews in Willow Creek the previous week had confirmed what she'd begun to suspect: a baby would arrive in late spring, almost exactly a year after Dawson's return. She hadn't told him yet, wanting to choose the perfect moment. Tonight, she decided. After supper, when they were relaxing by the fire, she would give him the news that would change their lives forever. The day passed in a flurry of activity: bread to be baked, laundry to be done before the weather turned too cold for outdoor drying, preparations for the evening meal. By the time Dawson and the hands returned from their work, the house was filled with the savory aroma of beef stew, simmering on the stove and fresh bread cooling on the table. After the hired men had been fed and retired to the bunkhouse built that summer, Kathleen and Dawson sat down to their own meal in the cozy kitchen. "The north pasture is holding up well," Dawson reported as he buttered a slice of bread. "If the weather stays mild, we can keep the cattle there another few weeks before moving them closer to the barn." Kathleen nodded, pushing her stew around her bowl more than eating it. Her appetite had been unpredictable lately, ravenous one moment, non-existent the next. Dawson noticed her distraction. "You're quiet again tonight. Are you feeling unwell?" She looked up, meeting his concerned gaze. "Not unwell exactly, just different," his brow furrowed. "Different how?" Taking a deep breath, Kathleen set down her spoon. "Dawson, do you remember that rocking chair you bought? The one you said might someday be used to rock our babies to sleep?" He nodded slowly, confusion still evident in his expression. "Well," she continued, her voice softening, "it seems that someday will be arriving sooner than we thought. Next spring, in fact." For a moment, Dawson simply stared at her, incomprehension gradually giving way to dawning understanding. "Kathleen," he whispered, "are you saying?" She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "We're going to have a baby, Dawson. Dr. Matthews confirmed it last week." The transformation of his expression was something Kathleen knew she would remember for the rest of her life, shock melting into wonder, then into a joy so pure and powerful it seemed to illuminate him from within. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the reality of the word. "Our baby." He was out of his chair in an instant, pulling her to her feet and into his arms, lifting her off the floor in an exuberant embrace that drew a startled laugh from her lips. "Careful," she protested, though she was laughing. "I'm in a delicate condition, remember." Dawson set her down immediately, his hands moving to cup her face with exquisite gentleness. "A baby," he said again, his voice filled with wonder. "Kathleen, you've made me the happiest man in the territory." Tears of joy sprang to her eyes. "You're pleased then? Pleased?" He echoed incredulously. There aren't words for what I'm feeling right now." He dropped to his knees before her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one," he whispered. "Your papa can't wait to meet you." The tenderness of the gesture undid Kathleen completely. Tears flowed freely as she stroked Dawson's dark hair, overwhelmed by the love that filled their home, their lives, their future. That night, as they lay tangled together beneath warm quilts while the first snow of the season fell softly outside their window, Dawson's hand rested protectively over Kathleen's abdomen. "Boy or girl?" he murmured sleepily against her hair. Kathleen smiled in the darkness. "Does it matter?" "Not one bit," he assured her. "Though I admit I've always envisioned a little girl with your green eyes and stubborn chin." She elbowed him gently. "My chin is not stubborn." If you say so," he chuckled, pulling her closer. "Whatever God blesses us with, this baby will be loved beyond measure." "And spoiled terribly by Uncle Tom, I suspect," Kathleen added, thinking of the gruff trail boss who had become such a friend to them both. "Without a doubt," Dawson agreed. "I can already see him teaching our child to ride before they can walk." As they drifted toward sleep, making plans and sharing dreams for their growing family, Kathleen felt a contentment deeper than any she had known before. The lonely winters of waiting seemed a distant memory now, replaced by the warm certainty of Dawson's love and the promise of the new life growing within her. Winter settled over Springtime Ranch with a series of snowstorms that blanketed the prairie in white. The work of maintaining a cattle operation continued despite the cold. Animals needed feeding and watering. Ice needed breaking. Buildings needed maintenance against the harsh elements. Kathleen's pregnancy progressed steadily, her slender frame gradually softening with the new life growing within. Dawson watched the changes in her body with fascination and a protectiveness that sometimes bordered on excessive. "I'm perfectly capable of carrying firewood," she protested one December afternoon as he intercepted her at the woodpile. "I know you are," Dawson replied, relieving her of the basket nonetheless. "But there's no need when I'm right here to do it for you." She sighed, but couldn't maintain her irritation in the face of his earnest concern. "At this rate, I'll be confined to a rocking chair by February, unable to do anything but knit booties." He grinned, unrepentant. "Would that be so terrible?" "It would drive me mad," she informed him, snatching back a single small log just to prove her point. "I've never been idle in my life, Dawson Reid, and I don't intend to start now just because I'm increasing." The term made him chuckle. "Increasing makes you sound like an investment that's gaining value." "Well," she retorted with a smile, "aren't I?" His expression softened as he gazed at her, snowflakes catching in her auburn hair. "Beyond all calculation," he said softly. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations for their first holiday as a married couple. Kathleen baked cookies and fruit pies, while Dawson ventured into the wooded area along the creek to cut a small pine tree. Together they decorated it with paper ornaments, strings of dried berries, and small candles to be lit on Christmas Eve. "My mother always said a house isn't truly a home until it's celebrated Christmas," Kathleen remarked as they stood back to admire their handiwork. Dawson slipped an arm around her waist, his hand coming to rest on the gentle swell of her abdomen. "Next year we'll have a little one to share it with," he mused. "Imagine how magical it will be then." On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts: a hand-knitted scarf from Kathleen to Dawson, and from him to her, a locket containing a tiny lock of his hair. "So you'll always have me close to your heart," he explained as he fastened the delicate chain around her neck, "even when I'm out working the range." Kathleen touched the locket gently. "It's beautiful, Dawson. I'll treasure it always." But the true gift of the season arrived that evening in the form of the baby's first distinct movements, fluttering sensations that Kathleen had initially dismissed as nerves or digestion, but now recognized as their child making its presence known. "Here," she said, guiding Dawson's hand to a spot just below her navel. "Wait a moment. There. Did you feel that?" The wonder that transformed his face as he felt the faint kick against his palm was a gift beyond price. "That's our baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our little Christmas miracle." January brought more snow and bitter cold, keeping them indoors much of the time. Kathleen used the enforced confinement to sew baby clothes and linens, while Dawson worked on crafting a cradle from oak salvaged from their packing crates. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, Kathleen in her rocking chair with her sewing, Dawson on the floor beside her, often reading aloud from one of the books Tom had brought. Sometimes they would simply talk, sharing memories of their childhoods or making plans for the ranch's future. "We should expand the garden come spring," Kathleen remarked one night. "With a baby coming, we'll want more vegetables to preserve for winter." Dawson nodded thoughtfully. "And I've been thinking about increasing the herd. Beef prices are good, and with the railroad pushing closer, shipping will become easier." "That means more hands to help," Kathleen observed. "The bunkhouse may need expanding too." He smiled up at her, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "Always thinking ahead." "What would I do without you? Fortunately, you'll never have to find out," she replied, running her fingers through his hair. "You're stuck with me, Dawson Reid. Me and this little one and however many more might come along." "A houseful," he said with conviction. A house full of children with your green eyes and brave heart. As January gave way to February, the weather turned even more severe. Blizzards swept across the prairie, sometimes confining them to the house for days at a time. The hired hands who had stayed on through the winter earned their wages twice over, battling through snow and ice to care for the cattle and maintain the ranch buildings. Kathleen's body continued to change, her movements becoming more deliberate as her center of gravity shifted with her growing belly. Dr. Matthews, making a house call during a brief break in the weather, pronounced her and the baby healthy and on track for a spring delivery. "First babies often come late," he cautioned as he packed away his stethoscope. "Don't be surprised if you're still waiting when May arrives." Kathleen exchanged a glance with Dawson. "This little one has already demonstrated remarkable timing," she said with a smile. "I expect nothing less for the grand entrance." As winter's grip began to loosen in early March, another visitor arrived at Springtime Ranch. Tom Blackwood, weathered face split by a grin as he dismounted in the yard. "Thought I'd check on you folks before heading back to Texas," he explained as Dawson pumped his hand in greeting. "Perfect timing," Dawson told him, clapping him on the shoulder. "We've news to share." Tom's eyebrows rose as Kathleen emerged from the house, her pregnancy now unmistakable beneath her woolen dress. "Well, I'll be," he said, removing his hat. "Looks like you two have been busy." Kathleen laughed, accepting his awkward but genuine congratulations. "The baby should arrive in late April or early May," she told him. "Just in time for spring roundup." "Excellent timing," Tom approved. "Nothing like a new calf to celebrate a successful season." Dawson shot him a warning look. "Did you just compare my wife to a cow, Tom?" The trail boss had the grace to look abashed. "Figure of speech only, I assure you, madam." Kathleen waved away his concern. "I've been called worse, Mr. Blackwood. Now come inside and tell us your news while I fix you something to eat. You look half-starved." Over a hearty meal of venison stew and fresh bread, Tom shared the latest from his travels: cattle prices in Texas, railroad developments that would soon make shipping easier, news of mutual acquaintances from Dawson's time on the trail. "And I've brought something for the little one," he added, reaching into his saddlebag. He withdrew a small package wrapped in soft leather. Kathleen unwrapped it to find a beautifully carved wooden horse, small enough for a child's hand, but detailed with remarkable precision. "Made it myself during winter evenings," Tom explained, looking slightly embarrassed by their evident appreciation. "Figured every ranch child should have a proper horse, even if it's just a wooden one to start." "It's beautiful," Kathleen said sincerely, running her fingers over the smooth curves. "Our baby's first gift from outside the family. We'll treasure it." Tom stayed for 2 days, helping Dawson assess the cattle that had survived the harsh winter and making plans for spring operations. When he departed, it was with promises to return in the summer to see the new addition to the Reid family. As March progressed, the snow began to melt in earnest, revealing the brown grass beneath. New green shoots appeared in sheltered spots, and the creek swelled with runoff from the distant hills. The world was awakening from its long slumber, preparing for rebirth. Kathleen felt her own body preparing as well. The baby moved more vigorously now, sometimes keeping her awake at night with acrobatics that Dawson could feel when he placed his hand on her rounded belly. "Active little thing," he commented one evening as a particularly energetic kick visibly shifted her dress. "Going to be a handful, I suspect." "Like father, like child," Kathleen retorted with a smile. "Eleanor tells me you were the terror of Willow Creek as a boy, always climbing the highest trees and jumping your horse over the widest creeks." Dawson had the grace to look sheepish. My poor mother had her hands full, that's certain." His expression softened. "She would have loved you, Kathleen, and she would have been over the moon about becoming a grandmother." Kathleen reached for his hand. "Tell me about her again," she requested. "I want our child to know about the grandmother they'll never meet." And so Dawson spoke of Sarah Reid, the strong-willed woman who had followed her husband west from Pennsylvania, who had taught her son to read by lamplight after long days of ranch work, who had faced down a bear with nothing but a broom to protect her vegetable garden. He described her laugh, her cooking, the way she could gentle the most skittish colt with just her voice and touch. "You remind me of her sometimes," he admitted. "That same quiet strength, that determination to create beauty even in harsh surroundings." Kathleen smiled, touched by the comparison. "And our baby will know your father too, through your stories." Dawson nodded, his expression more somber. James Reid had been killed in a range accident when Dawson was 16, thrown from his horse while checking cattle in a spring thunderstorm. The loss had shaped his son in profound ways, teaching him early about life's fragility and the importance of seizing happiness when it was offered. "I wish they could have met you," Dawson said quietly. "Seen what we're building here, known their grandchild." "They know," Kathleen assured him, placing his hand on her belly where the baby kicked steadily. "Somehow, I believe they know." April arrived with its characteristic mix of sunshine and rain, painting the prairie with swathes of wildflowers that transformed the landscape. The cattle grew sleek on the new grass, and calves frolicked in the warming air, their playful antics a daily source of amusement. Kathleen's due date approached, bringing with it both anticipation and a certain restlessness. She had prepared everything: tiny clothes washed and folded in the beautifully crafted cradle, clean linen stored for the birth, arrangements made for Alina Peterson to come stay when the time came to assist with the delivery. "I feel like I'm waiting for a storm to break," she confessed to Dawson one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular colors. "Everything's ready, yet I can't settle." He squeezed her hand. "Nature works in its own time," he reminded her. "The baby will come when it's ready, just like spring comes to the prairie when the time is right." She leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I'm a little frightened," she admitted in a whisper. "Not of the pain, I've expected that, but of everything changing. Of not knowing if I'll be a good mother." Dawson turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Kathleen Reid doubting herself. I never thought I'd see the day." He touched her cheek gently. "You will be an extraordinary mother. Just as you're an extraordinary wife, an extraordinary rancher, an extraordinary woman in every way." She smiled despite herself. "You're biased." "Completely," he agreed cheerfully, "and correct nonetheless." 3 days later, as dawn broke clear and bright over Springtime Ranch, Kathleen woke to a sharp pain low in her back that radiated around to her abdomen. She lay still, waiting to see if it would return, and when it did several minutes later, she knew. "Dawson," she said, touching his shoulder. "It's time." He was instantly alert, sitting up and reaching for his clothes. "I'll send one of the hands for Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Peterson," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the flash of panic she saw in his eyes. "There's plenty of time," she assured him, easing herself out of bed. First babies are rarely in a hurry. But this baby, it seemed, had its own ideas. By mid-morning, Kathleen's pains were coming regularly and with increasing intensity. Alina arrived, taking charge with calm efficiency born of having assisted at dozens of births. "You men make yourselves useful elsewhere," she instructed Dawson and the ranch hands who hovered anxiously near the house. "This is women's work now." Banished to the barn, Dawson paced like a caged mountain lion, alternating between prayer and profanity as the hours passed, and the sounds of Kathleen's labor occasionally reached his ears. "She's strong, boss," offered Miguel, one of the hands who had stayed on through the winter. "The Senora, she has the heart of a warrior." Dawson nodded, grateful for the support but unable to find words to express his fear not just of the physical dangers of childbirth, which were considerable on the frontier, but of the overwhelming responsibility of parenthood. What did he know about being a father? His own had been taken from him when he was still a boy himself. As the afternoon waned toward evening, Dr. Matthews finally arrived, having been delayed by a difficult river crossing. He entered the house without ceremony, leaving Dawson to resume his anxious pacing. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, when a new sound cut through the air, the thin, indignant wail of a newborn announcing its arrival to the world. Dawson froze, his heart seeming to stop and then restart at double speed. He was moving before he realized it, crossing the yard in long strides, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. Eleanor met him at the door, her face weary but wreathed in a smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Reid," she said. "You have a healthy daughter." A daughter. The word echoed in his mind as he entered the bedroom where Kathleen lay propped against pillows, her face pale but radiant with a joy he had never seen before. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a tiny bundle with a shock of dark hair. "Dawson," Kathleen said softly, looking up as he approached. "Come meet your daughter." He moved as if in a dream, lowering himself carefully to sit beside them on the bed. The baby, his daughter, was impossibly small, her face still red and wrinkled from the ordeal of birth, her tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight the whole world if necessary. "She has your hair," Kathleen whispered, "and I think she may have your stubborn disposition as well." She was certainly in a hurry to get here. Dawson couldn't speak. His throat had closed with emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him. Gently, reverently, he reached out to touch the baby's cheek with one finger. Her skin was softer than anything he had ever felt, and when she turned her head slightly toward his touch, he felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Would you like to hold her?" Kathleen asked. He hesitated, suddenly aware of his large, rough hands calloused from rope and reins. "I might break her," Kathleen smiled. "You won't. Here." With infinite care, she transferred the tiny bundle into his arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, yet Dawson felt as though he held the entire world. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused, but already showing hints of the green that matched her mother's, and then closed again as she settled against his chest. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been waiting to meet you for a very long time." As night fell over Springtime Ranch, Dawson sat in the rocking chair beside the bed where Kathleen rested, their daughter cradled in his arms. Outside, stars appeared one by one in the vast Nebraska sky, witness to the miracle that had unfolded beneath them. "She needs a name," Kathleen said softly from the bed. Dawson looked up. "I thought, if it's all right with you, Sarah, after my mother." Tears glistened in Kathleen's eyes. "Sarah," she repeated. "It's perfect. Sarah Elizabeth Reid." "Elizabeth was your mother's name," Dawson recalled. Kathleen nodded, both our mothers watching over her. Dawson gazed down at his sleeping daughter, marveling at the perfection of her tiny features. "Sarah Elizabeth Reid," he murmured. "Welcome to Springtime Ranch. Welcome to our family." As the baby slept peacefully in his arms, Dawson found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, he had ridden away from Kathleen with dreams and promises, uncertain of what the future held. Now he sat in the home they had built together, holding the physical embodiment of their love, surrounded by the life they had created through hard work, determination, and unwavering faith in each other. Springtime had indeed brought renewal to the land and to their hearts. As the first stars of evening twinkled outside their window, Dawson Reid thanked God for the woman who had waited through winter after winter, until he returned in spring with a ring and a promise of forever. And as little Sarah Elizabeth stirred in his arms, opening her eyes to gaze up at him with unfocused wonder, he made a silent vow to be worthy of the precious gifts he had been given: this land, this woman, this child, this family that was his to protect and cherish for all the days of his life. The years that followed the birth of Sarah Elizabeth Reid were filled with the kind of joy and challenge that shapes a family's legacy. Springtime Ranch prospered under Dawson and Kathleen's careful management, the herd growing from the original 50 head to over 300 within 5 years. The small cabin where they had begun their life together now served as a storage shed, replaced by the comfortable 2-story home that anchored the expanding ranch operations. Sarah grew from a determined infant into a spirited child who could ride almost as soon as she could walk, her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes combining with a personality uniquely her own. By the time she was 4, she was Dawson's shadow, following him around the ranch and absorbing everything about cattle and horses with an eagerness that made him burst with pride. "She's going to be running this place before she's 15, he remarked to Kathleen one evening as they watched their daughter solemnly explaining to a new calf how to properly eat grass. Kathleen laughed, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen where their second child was growing. "Heaven help us if this one's half as strong-willed." The second pregnancy had come as a joyful surprise after they had begun to wonder if Sarah would be an only child. Now, with the baby due in late summer, they were preparing for another expansion of their family. Tom Blackwood, who had become a regular visitor to Springtime Ranch and a beloved uncle to Sarah, arrived in June with his customary impeccable timing and a pack horse laden with gifts. "Thought I'd better come see you folks before the new little cowpoke arrives," he announced as he dismounted in the yard, "and to bring Miss Sarah her birthday present a bit early." Sarah, who had been helping Kathleen hang laundry, dropped her small basket and raced across the yard. "Uncle Tom, did you bring me a real horse this time?" Tom swept her up into his arms with a hearty laugh. "Not this year, Princess. Your pa would have my hide if I brought a horse without consulting him first, but I might have something you'll like almost as much." Under Dawson's amused supervision, Tom unpacked a child-sized saddle, carefully crafted and tooled with Sarah's initials. "For when your pa decides you're ready for your own mount," he explained as the little girl ran her hands over the smooth leather in wonder. "Which won't be for some time yet," Dawson interjected firmly, though his expression softened at his daughter's pleading look. "But when the time comes, you'll be properly equipped." That evening, after Sarah had been tucked into bed with promises that Uncle Tom would still be there in the morning, the adults sat on the porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze and catching up on news. "Railroad's coming through just 20 miles south of here next year," Tom informed them, sipping the coffee Kathleen had prepared. "Going to change everything for ranchers in these parts." Dawson nodded thoughtfully. "We've been hearing the rumors. Easier shipping, better prices. But more people too. More fences, more boundaries. Progress," Tom said with a shrug. "Can't stop it, might as well profit from it." He glanced at Kathleen. "Speaking of profit, that bull I brought up last spring has produced some fine calves. Your herd's developing a reputation for quality." Kathleen smiled, pleased by the recognition of their hard work. "We've been selective about breeding. No point raising scrub cattle when the good ones eat the same grass." Tom chuckled. "You sound like a rancher born and bred, Mrs. Reid. Hard to believe you were once a town girl." "Hardly a town," Kathleen corrected him. "Willow Creek was barely a wide spot in the trail when I was growing up, and I've learned a lot since then." She glanced at Dawson with affection. "Had a good teacher." "More like we learned together," Dawson said, reaching over to take her hand. "Making it up as we went along half the time." "Well, whatever you did, it worked," Tom observed, gesturing toward the prosperous ranch spread out before them. "You've built something special here." As July gave way to August, the heat settled over the prairie like a wool blanket. Kathleen grew increasingly uncomfortable as her pregnancy advanced, finding relief only in the early mornings and late evenings, when the temperature dropped to bearable levels. "This one's going to be a boy," she declared one night as she sat on the edge of their bed, trying to find a comfortable position. "Only a son of yours would insist on arriving during the hottest part of summer." Dawson, who was helping her remove her shoes since she could no longer reach them easily, looked up with a grin. "Don't blame me. Could just as easily be a daughter with your timing, determined to make the most dramatic entrance possible." The baby, as if responding to the discussion, delivered a particularly energetic kick that made Kathleen gasp. "Either way, I think this child might be part mule. The stubbornness certainly runs in both our families." When labor began 3 days later, in the pre-dawn hours of a scorching August morning, it progressed with a speed that took them both by surprise. Dr. Matthews, summoned by a ranch hand riding at breakneck speed, arrived barely an hour before Daniel James Reid made his appearance, announcing his arrival with lusty cries that brought his sister running from the next room where Alina Peterson had been attempting to keep her occupied. "Is that my baby?" Sarah demanded, trying to peer around Alina's skirts at the source of the commotion. "Indeed it is, Miss Sarah," Dr. Matthews confirmed, smiling at the wide-eyed child. "You have a brother." "A brother." Sarah's expression was dubious. "I asked for a sister." "Can we send him back?" The adults' laughter filled the room, breaking the tension of the delivery. Even Kathleen, exhausted but radiant, couldn't suppress a chuckle at her daughter's candid disappointment. "I'm afraid he's here to stay," Dawson told Sarah, lifting her up to see the red-faced infant nestled in Kathleen's arms. "This is your brother, Daniel." Sarah studied the baby with critical attention. "He's very small," she observed, "and wrinkly, like Mrs. Peterson's old dog." Alina made a sound of protest, but Kathleen waved it away. "He'll grow," she assured her daughter, "and someday he'll be your best friend and strongest ally." Sarah looked unconvinced but reached out cautiously to touch the baby's tiny hand. When his fingers reflexively curled around hers, her expression transformed with wonder. "He's holding my hand, Papa. Look." "He knows his big sister," Dawson said, his voice rough with emotion as he watched his children's first interaction. "He's going to need you to show him everything, Sarah. To help him learn and grow." The responsibility clearly appealed to the 4-year-old, who straightened her shoulders with sudden importance. "I'll teach him all about horses," she declared, "and how to find the best berries and where the prairie dogs have their town." "I'm sure you will," Kathleen said, exchanging an amused glance with Dawson over their daughter's head. "But perhaps we should let him learn to walk first." Daniel proved to be a content baby, with Dawson's gray eyes and a temperament that was, to everyone's relief, considerably more placid than his sister's had been. He thrived under the combined attention of his parents and his big sister, who took her role as mentor and protector with utmost seriousness. As summer faded into fall, and fall gave way to winter, the Reid family settled into a new rhythm accommodating their expanded numbers. The ranch continued to prosper, with cattle prices rising thanks to increased demand from the east and improved shipping methods. By the time spring returned to the prairie, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and wildflower colors, Daniel was crawling with determination, and Sarah was proudly riding her own pony, a gentle mare Dawson had selected specifically for her 5th birthday. On a warm April evening, with the children finally asleep after a day of outdoor adventures, Kathleen and Dawson sat on their porch swing, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. 10 years, Kathleen mused, leaning against his solid warmth. It was almost exactly 10 years ago that you rode away, promising to return when you could offer me more than dreams. Dawson pressed a kiss to her temple. And 7 years since I came back with that ring, praying you'd still want me after making you wait so long. She turned to look at him, reaching up to trace the familiar lines of his face, the scar on his cheek, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes that deepened with his smile, the streaks of silver now appearing at his temples. I would have waited longer, she admitted softly. As long as it took. His arm tightened around her. Thank God you didn't have to. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of their ranch, the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant pastures, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods along the creek. Do you ever wonder, Kathleen asked eventually, what might have happened if you hadn't gone? If we'd married when you first asked me before you left to seek your fortune? Dawson considered the question. Sometimes, he acknowledged. We might have struggled more, started smaller. Or maybe we wouldn't have ended up here at all. He looked out over the prosperous ranch that had grown from their combined dreams and efforts. But I think we would have found our way to happiness one way or another. I think so too, Kathleen agreed. Some things are simply meant to be. As if to punctuate her words, the door behind them creaked open and Sarah appeared in her nightgown, clutching her wooden horse. I had a bad dream, she announced, climbing into her father's lap without invitation. There was a wolf, and he was chasing me and Daniel. Dawson smoothed her dark hair. It was just a dream, sweetheart. There are no wolves here, and even if there were, your mama and I would never let anything hurt you or your brother. Sarah nodded solemnly, accepting this assurance with the complete faith of a child in her parents' ability to keep the world safe and orderly. Can I stay here with you for a little while? Of course, Kathleen said, making room for her daughter between them on the swing. As Sarah settled between her parents, secure in their love and protection, Dawson caught Kathleen's eye over their daughter's head. The look they shared held a decade of memories, the young couple they had been, the challenges they had faced, the life they had built together against the backdrop of the untamed Nebraska prairie. And as the first star of evening appeared in the darkening sky, Dawson Reid silently renewed the promise he had made when he returned to Kathleen with a ring, and a future to offer to love her through all seasons, through joy and sorrow, through the building of a ranch and the raising of a family, for all the days of their lives. Springtime Ranch would continue to grow and flourish in the years ahead, weathering droughts and blizzards, celebrating births and mourning inevitable losses, adapting to the changing West as railroads and telegraph lines brought the wider world ever closer to their doorstep. But through it all, at its heart would remain the love story of a woman who had waded through winter after winter, and the cowboy who had returned to her in spring, keeping his promise of a lifetime together on the land they both loved.